All right, let's dive into a really fascinating story about an invisible choke point in our global energy system. It's all about how the future of AI and nuclear power is, believe it or not, being held hostage by a shortage of a surprisingly simple industrial chemical.
So how on earth could the super advanced world of artificial intelligence, with its insane appetite for computing power, be connected to some basic chemical you'd find in a factory? Well, the answer reveals this hidden fragility in the supply chains that, frankly, we all depend on.
Okay, to really get what's going on here, we first have to look at two massive global trends that are basically crashing into each other. And both are creating this unprecedented demand for clean, reliable, 24/7 power. So on one hand, you've got what people are calling the nuclear renaissance. As countries try to decarbonize, they're not just building new reactors, they're extending the lives of old ones. At the exact same time, the AI boom is creating these data centers that use city-sized amounts of electricity, and they need that power to be carbon-free and always on. You throw in all the geopolitical tensions pushing countries toward energy independence, and suddenly everybody wants nuclear power. And that means, of course, that everyone wants uranium. This is where our story takes us to Central Asia, because when the world needs uranium, it turns to one country more than anything else, Kazakhstan. But right when demand is absolutely exploding, the world's biggest supplier is hitting a pretty serious wall.
I mean, just look at the scale here. To say Kazakhstan is a major player in the uranium market is a huge understatement. They are the market. They produce a staggering 40 to 45% of the entire world's supply. No one else even comes close. The global nuclear industry pretty much runs on Kazakh uranium.
And yet, in 2024, the state atomic company Kazatomprom announced it had failed to meet its production goals. Now, in a market this concentrated with demand this high, a miss like that sends absolute shockwaves through the entire system.
So what happened? Did they just suddenly run out of uranium? Nope, not at all. The geological reserves are still there, totally vast and untapped. The problem isn't in the rock, it's in the process they use to get it out. And this brings us to the hidden secret of how Kazakhstan actually mines its uranium. And trust me, it is probably not what you're picturing. So forget dynamite and giant dump trucks. They use a method called in-situ leaching, or ISL. It's less about brute force digging and way more about chemistry. They essentially mine with liquid.
Here's how it works. First, they inject a solution, in this case sulfuric acid, deep underground into the uranium ore. Then, that acid just dissolves the uranium right out of the porous rock. After that, they pump that uranium-rich liquid back to the surface, and finally, they process it. It's an incredibly efficient method, but it has one giant vulnerability.
And right there, that first step, that is the entire choke point. The whole operation depends completely on a massive, steady supply of sulfuric acid. If you don't have it, you can't dissolve the uranium. The mineral's there, but it's effectively locked in the ground, totally out of reach. Okay, so this is where the story gets really weird. You would think a country that relies so heavily on sulfuric acid would have an endless supply, right? Well, that leads us to what I'm calling the Great Sulfur Paradox. The scale here is just mind-boggling. As a byproduct of its giant oil and gas fields, Kazakhstan produces and exports over 5 million metric tons of raw sulfur every single year. They are literally drowning in the base ingredient needed to make sulfuric acid. But here's the critical failure. For years, they exported the cheap raw material instead of investing in the factories to turn it into the high-value acid they desperately needed at home. This created this absurd situation where they're exporting millions of tons of sulfur, while at the same time having to import hundreds of thousands of tons of the finished acid just to keep their own industry running. It's a classic infrastructure gap. So yeah, the problem was never geology. It was a total failure of industrial planning. They had all the ingredients, but they just didn't have enough kitchens to cook with. So you might be thinking, okay, a domestic infrastructure issue in Central Asia. Why should the rest of the world care? Well, because when the dominant supplier catches a cold, the entire global market gets the flu. This local problem is now a global bottleneck. Market analysts have basically mapped out what they're calling a 3-year squeeze. They're projecting 2026 will be the year of peak constraint. That means maximum stress on supply chains and, you guessed it, higher prices. Relief is only going to start gradually in 2027 as new solutions come online, before the market finds a new and permanently changed balance in 2028 or even later.
And the ripple effects? They're being felt everywhere. Uranium conversion plants are facing shortages of the raw materials they need.
Power companies are scrambling to lock in long-term contracts, often at painfully high prices. The crisis is forcing this desperate search for non-Kazakh sources of uranium, and all this price volatility makes it way harder to get the financing for the next generation of nuclear reactors.
But look, the story doesn't just end in a crisis. There is a solution in the works. It's a massive industrial project designed to finally close this infrastructure gap, and it's called the Zhanatas solution.
This is it, a brand new, large-scale sulfuric acid plant that came online in late 2025. With an annual capacity of 800,000 metric tons, this single facility is an absolute game-changer. It's designed to finally produce the acid Kazakhstan needs from the sulfur it already has.
But, and this is a big but, building a factory is one thing, getting it to full speed is another. The ramp-up schedule shows this isn't a light switch. It's going to take the entire year of 2026 just to get this plant close to full production. So the relief is coming, but it is going to be a slow and steady process.
What's the big lesson in all of this? It's actually pretty simple. Having a resource in the ground is basically meaningless if you don't have the industrial capacity to process it. The factory is just as important as the mine.
And that leaves us with the final, bigger question. This whole crisis was caused by something as mundane as sulfuric acid. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If a basic chemical can stall the future of AI and clean energy, what other simple invisible choke points are hiding in plain sight in the global supply chains we rely on every single day?